It's strange. It's not very often in London you see an exhibition of London in terms of photography. You know, the Museum of London have done some regular shows. Many, many years ago, the Photographer's Gallery, I think for 3 years, did a commission of new work on London. And then all of a sudden, we have 2 shows. There's one at the Tate, which I think is opening in about 3 weeks' time, from a private collection, which is being donated. And then here, there's an exhibition about London. It obviously connects to the Olympics. Peter, if someone came in from Beijing and read the description that this is new work about London, and they came in and said, where is London?
Sorry, where is London? I would say, while you're in this room, London's here. In this room.
We want more.
I guess, you know, we have to bear in mind that I started work on this series of pictures 5 years ago. And I was shooting film for 2 years, and I realized towards the end of those 2 years that I'd got to the end of the road shooting film. And I went through that whole process of starting to scan, you know, making very high quality scans and picking prints from negatives. And I realized that there was something not quite right, because I was getting amazing colours, but also there were discrepancies in the prints that really annoyed me and irritated me, and that got me thinking about, well, film was never designed to be scanned. You know, scanners are obviously an ingenious response to a need to generate a digital file from negatives. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I probably wanted to use the piece of equipment that was designed from the ground up to generate a digital file from real life. And I bought a digital camera, and as soon as I started making the first couple of prints with Nikon, it doesn't really matter what it was. It was a Nikon D700, so it was a full-frame digital camera. And I realized I was, you know, film and I were through. That was the end of my 35 years old affair with film. In fact, it was longer than that, because I got my first camera when I was 7 years old. So, you know, it was 50 years of a love affair with film. And I could see only too clearly, as possibly you can, in the prints around us at the moment, that curiously, first of all, there's no grain, and I really wanted to get away from grain. And the strange thing is that I feel with these images that they're filmic in the sense of when we go and see a movie, we're not really necessarily aware of the mechanics of how the image is constructed. In other words, we go to the movies and we see the screen, and we're not aware of grain or anything like that, generally speaking, unless maybe it's an art house movie or something like that. And the benefit of that is that it seems to be a window on the world, so it's completely plausible the way we feel we can accept, if you like, the action and the story that's taking place.
I'm going to bring my visitor from China back later on.
Okay.
You're talking about grain.
Yeah.
Just reading the way you talk about your work is about the materiality of the world. Could you argue that articulating grain is about the material of the film? Where is the materiality in these digital files?
Materiality for me is in the print itself. And I think what's really, really interesting is, for a start, you know, according to the world color expert, or one of the two perhaps, Henry Wilhelm in the States, these new pigment prints, these are actually Hewlett-Packard prints as opposed to Epson. And when they both chose their criteria for developing these new pigment prints, they actually chose different criteria. Epson went for a full color gamut, and Hewlett-Packard went for longevity. So you need more inks with a Hewlett-Packard print. But the thing is that Wilhelm thinks that these are going to be stable for in excess of 250 years. And I think this is really, really important, and I know I'm not alone. A lot of collectors, a lot of museums are becoming very, very interested in the idea of colour prints lasting for considerable periods of time. And I have heard privately that Wilhelm has said that maybe under museum conditions, these kinds of prints are going to be stable for 500 years perhaps. In other words, on a par with medieval painting, which for a photographer is very interesting territory. But in a sense, the materiality, to come back directly to your question with these prints for me, certainly lies very much in terms of the handling of the material, it's completely different. It's paper, so it's completely different to the plastic coated both sides C-type material that we're familiar with, which always to me felt quite plasticky. I never really liked that material. I also found, or at least I realise now, that the colours, one learned to accept the colours of C-type prints as being the colours of colour photography. But actually, it was simply because we had decade after decade after decade of seeing how colour negatives printed onto C-type material and interpreted the colours of the world. But the weight of this paper, which is like 300 GSM, so in other words, it's more like the old black and white paper, double weight printing paper. And the surface texture is something which I really, really love. These are far superior in tactile terms and in almost every other sense. The colour gamut is completely different, and so on.
Because from probably the early 70s until today, one of the key changes in kind of photographic theory was to totally ignore technology, and was to talk about the meaning of the image. So it's quite unusual when you start talking and what you are talking about is the technology of making, which in one sense I find quite professional. Let's come back to that. But do you think talking about the paper and the inks, then you don't want to talk about the image?
I'm really happy to talk about where the work comes from, but I think we have to arrive at the right position for that to begin to unfold, because that's a pretty complicated process. But it doesn't surprise me in the slightest that you're suggesting that I'm talking about something that hasn't necessarily always been fashionable.
Well, I mean, for me, I find it quite interesting. There's kind of, if you look at other people art forms which are generally talked about in the media, then the technology is recognised and discussed.
Yeah.
In photography, and definitely in the last 30 years, the process of making the image and the technology that is form has been made of, it's generally been discussed as kind of large format and medium format, and digital or analog. You can find as personally as kind of not important, as kind of really misunderstanding. But if we went to a photography club 30 years ago, the main thing we were talking about would be the camera and the print. That's virtually disappeared.
Well, actually, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, because I'm enjoying your question as it unfolds. But before you finish it, I have to remind you that, with all due respect, you're not a photographer, at least as far as I'm aware. But many photographers I'm familiar with talk about technical stuff in very great detail. So I just wanted to make that point.
Well, I was a photographer.
You were a photographer. Are you still a photographer?
For 2 weeks a year. But I'm going to find that fascinating of being able to talk about the camera again, and the implications of talking about the camera, what the camera can do, and the relationship of the camera to the photographer. Because in your work, there's a sense of you as their body kind of moving in space and getting closer and nearer. And where, if you think crudely about the last 20 years, some of the way the photography is being seen has been about the landscape, urban and rural. You are very much about going in, and there's a sense of you physically going in to find the subject.
Do you mean as opposed to, say, choosing a high vantage point and looking down on the world?
Yeah.
Almost.
Or even a long distance.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that's really true, and I think it's really important. I think it was almost inevitable because of a really key experience I had when I was 15 years old, which I have written about, but for the purposes of the audience and the talk at the moment. When I was 15 years old, I was a schoolboy in Cardiff, in South Wales, and like at the end of the academic year, quite often, at least this used to be the case, the headmaster would say to all the classes, it was a boys' school, come into the assembly room, I'm going to show you something, the assembly hall. And this was absolutely incredible for me, because what he showed us all in 1968 was Powers of 10 by Charles and Ray Eames. Now, for those of you who have not seen the film, essentially, it kind of opens with a view looking down on a couple on a picnic rug, very suddenly the camera goes up 10 times the distance that it was at the starting point, powers of 10. And it does this relentlessly. So quite quickly you can see that these people are having a picnic on the edge of, is it Lake Michigan, that Chicago is on the edge of, and then it just keeps going. Quite quickly Earth is just a tiny little dot. And then within about 5 minutes, and I don't really understand how they were able to do this in 68, surely that's pre-access to computing, generally speaking, unless they knew some very, very fancy friends with the right equipment. Anyway, they were able to make this movie in such a convincing way that you've been taken right to the edge of the imagined universe after about 5 minutes. So in fact, Earth disappeared after about 10, 15 seconds. And then it started to come back, 1/10 the distance all the time. And so maybe 8 minutes after the beginning of the film, the camera kind of got back to where it began, and then very suddenly it just went like this to the back of the hand of one of the people having a picnic. And then it just kept going. Down, 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 right down to an atomic level. So at the age of 15, one of the things that I was absolutely blown away by was the argument that there is no hierarchical relationship between large and small. Everything which is large, unimaginably large, in the universe is made up of the smallest possible things. And I think that it really did have a very profound effect on me, because from an early age I was interested, I thought small things were interesting and important, really, really important. And of course, there are many, many ways to sort of increase one's self-confidence about that point of view. For example, if you investigate nature, the deeper you go into nature, I mean, it's just the beauty that you find is absolutely spectacular. And if you like, the operational details of nature, the deeper you go into it, sort of almost defy the imagination. So exquisitely is the world constructed at that level. And I think it goes some way anyway to explaining why I've always been really, really interested in going into photograph, generally speaking over 30 years, smaller things. And in order to do that, you have to get in there to bring, I hope, the whole thing, my answer right back to your question. You can't do that. You can't do that job from a distance.
In a sense, you're maybe using the camera as a microscope to pick up details and then bring them into a collection, a book, or an exhibition.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just thinking back to 68. I think that was already the beginning of the Apollo.
Absolutely
And
right.
that sort of space.
Yeah, and those things are really connected in my head as well.
Cool. I'm just interested in why you made that. I mean, you could take a wider view, a landscape image, and maybe deal with some of the themes you're dealing with. But it was very much a kind of looking for things in the world, looking for maybe everyday things, something you just kind of fall upon or find. A lot of your stories are about being in the car, getting out of the car, walking around and seeing something extraordinary.
Yes. So sorry, was that a question, or
Yeah,
were you just describing how I would? How has that come about?
Yeah.
Well, I think that
I think travel seems to be important.
yes, travel has been important, but I mean, one of the things that I'm not necessarily going to place a very high level of importance on is anecdotal stuff. I mean, I'm happy to talk about, as you can see, some of that sort of thing, but I'm also really, really happy actually to talk about ideas behind the work. But it seems to me that if you're interested in intensity, trying to communicate intense feeling and generally speaking intensity, then going in close is one way of doing it. I mean, obviously somebody like Batinsky photographs from a great distance, is generating images of considerable intensity, but from a distance. But it's a very different kind of intensity. And it's not, I guess I've just managed to find the way that works for me, There was never any real question. I've obviously made photographs, maybe 15 feet from the subject. And certainly when I worked with the images in Deep Blue, when I went around the world photographing, trying to make portraits of machines at different scientific sites, as opposed to photographs of machines. then often I was, but it's still not landscape. The really strange thing is that I'm working on a whole new series of pictures now, a homage to mathematics, and I'm making landscape pictures of portraits, amazingly. So, in a sense, it's been a case of, you know, the appropriate distance for the work in hand.
I'm just going to read you a quote I found this afternoon.
Okay.
And this is from The Invisible Cities. It's about Marco Polo describing a bridge. And basically describes a bridge, not as a bridge, it describes a bridge stone by stone. So it's not the arc of the bridge, but it's about the physicality.
Yeah.
And some of that is kind of connected, I'm saying for maybe London, you know, it's kind of, each image is a kind of, a component.
A stone in a bridge.
In a bridge. And that bridge is
I like that.
And the idea of walking and sense of imagination and motion.
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead?
No, I mean that's...
Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to quote. But that's the general spirit of it.
And that's, you know, thinking of it's not a novel, Invisible Cities. It's a kind of structure of imagination, of two people speaking different languages.
Yeah.
So there's kind of misunderstanding.
Yes.
And understanding at the same time.
Yes.
But it's not, it could be one place, it could be no place.
Yes.
And the interesting Marco Polo's original work from the 13th century, it was just, it was not written by Polo.
That's what I've heard recently.
It was written by, when he was in jail, by someone transcribing his imagination.
Yeah.
And there's even suggestions that he never went to China.
I've heard that too.
And
how perfect is that?
So in a sense, where are we in this work? And that is a sense of a space you've created,
yes,
where we can imagine to be very slender. Who knows? So it's a sense of giving the space for the vision or the reader or the person to write.
And what I would ask you to do is to imagine two people standing on the edge of a cliff. And it's a windy day. And the wind is pushing the clouds at speed across the sky. And these two people are standing next to each other. I do not believe they see the same thing. If we imagine their entire sphere of apprehension as a circle, I think these circles overlap a little bit. And where they overlap, that territory that's enclosed by the overlapping allows them to speak to each other about the common aspect of their experience. Everything else outside of that, would that be an ellipse that would be enclosed by those two circles intersecting, something like that. Everything else would be their own experience. And in a sense, I think that points the finger very powerfully at the idea that everything that we can actually apprehend in the world around us is mediated by the imagination. And therefore, in a way, I think, for obvious reasons, this connects very, very deeply with the project that we're looking at around us at the moment. If I believe, as I do, that when we're looking at an orange, or we're looking at a bus, or we're looking at the person we love, the optic nerves are sending information to the brain, but the imagination is, if you like, interpreting the information before we arrive at a conclusion about what it is that we're experiencing or what it is we're observing. And if this is true, then it makes perfect sense to generate through pictures that come from upsurges of energy from the subconscious mind into the conscious mind, I think. I mean, for me, the unconscious is a vast territory, limitless. The conscious mind, which is that's the mind I think we use to get through every day and avoid getting run over when we cross the road, pay the electricity bill, and do those utilitarian things. But I think the unconscious mind is infinitely large, and I think a great deal of the most interesting creative work comes from those incidences of energy upsurges from the unconscious into the conscious mind.
Some writers would suggest the unconscious is not very, very limited, because in a sense it's got to be articulated, and once it's articulated, either through writing or a novel or photographs, you're already engaging in a conscious one.
I wouldn't accept that, because my view is that the unconscious mind is effectively limitless. The issue becomes one of limits when we try to make sense of some of those occasional upsurges of energy from the unconscious mind into the conscious mind. The conscious mind is constantly trying to understand what's going on.
So in a sense, when you're walking around, let's say, in a city, maybe London,
Yeah.
I remember you talk about the kind of being in the zone.
Yeah.
You're looking for that moment when something kind of pings.
I may not even be looking for it, but I may have tried to put myself into a framework in which that can happen, and I can be conscious of it, aware of it happening. Because in a sense, I've tried quite hard to keep the prosaic aspects of what the conscious mind is preoccupied with at a distance. And that's in a way, I know being in the zone sounds like I've been smoking too much. You know, for me, it's quite meaningful.
I'm going to kind of raise it, and we haven't discussed this. I mean, you did something in the Guardian 2 weeks ago.
Yes, I know.
And it's the kind of response has been quite extraordinary. I mean,
Yeah, I saw
depressing
something.
in one sense.
I saw something.
How do you respond to that? As being in the public, I think the image you showed them was probably extraordinary, but a lot of people thought it wasn't.
You know, the invitation to do the thing with the Guardian was...
Sorry, did people read this in the Guardian?
It was called my... they do it often. It's called My Best Shot. They invite a photographer to choose what they... It's never your best shot. It's just an opportunity to get publicity and to publicise a show, which is basically what happened. So, you know, I thought, well, okay, let's give this a whirl. I hadn't done it before. I chose a picture which I liked. It's not my best shot. I don't know what the best shot means. I wouldn't even know how to work that out. I wrote a piece to accompany the picture, which was extremely precise. I worked really, really hard to condense everything I wanted to say about that picture and the experience of bringing it into the world as carefully as I possibly could. And what they actually ran was something it was rewritten. It wasn't actually what I said. Parts of it were. But, for example, there was an absolutely key error that they made for me, and that was that I was talking about that series whereby my traditional interest in photographing small things collided with a belief that I have that increasingly the surface of the world looks the way it does, increasingly looks the way it does, because the way the human brain directs the hand to change the shape and nature of materials. And I think you could look at the melting of the ice caps, you could look at the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest, any number of different things, increasing building of roadworks or whatever you like. But the Guardian said, you know, they quoted me as having said, the surface of the world looks the way it looks because of the way of the brain directing. So not increasingly, but full stop. So there were people in the comments section of the online version who were saying, Peter Fraser's an idiot. What about mountains? You know, so it's the risk you take. You get involved with something like that. It's for a general audience.
So it does suggest that, you know, the image is very strong, but the context and the way it's written about just takes it somewhere else. And then so there's this kind of idea that someone could come to the image and maybe have their own imagination is kind of undermined. In a sense, it's always the context of where that image is shown.
Well, that's true, and certainly reading through the responses was quite an education experience. Some of them were so vitriolic that I couldn't imagine they were looking at the same picture. But I guess they must have been. Although, funnily enough, I think there were at least 100 comments the last time I looked, and I'm not going back to that. But something like about 50 or 60 of the way through, there seemed to be people coming forward saying, actually, you know, you really are talking a lot of rubbish. Yeah. And there were some more intelligent comments. But it's been pointed out to me that actually to have such a vigorous and vociferous response to an image is actually complimentary. But it's taken me a few days to understand.
I think Peter's been in bed for 2 weeks. So
I kind of have. I had an operation on my knee. I'm only
still want to talk generally about the work we're looking
Sure.
at golf and a couple of other kind of directions. You spent, was it 5 years?
On this work?
Yeah.
Well, in the sense that I started shooting film,
Yeah.
so I worked for 2 years. I realised I had buffers, like I was saying, I bought a scanner and so on. And when I began shooting digitally, the work was entirely different. It couldn't be more different. And I realised I had to put 2 years' work, well, away, and I'm never going to use it.
But a lot of
So I had to start again in 2008.
A lot of what I see, I think a few people have mentioned this, it's work which is on display. It might be in a museum. Was that kind of conscious decision?
No, not at all. To be honest with you, I don't know what this sounds like, but I've never made work for an audience. I wouldn't know how to do that. I mean, and in fact, you know, the very
I'm not
thing
saying
that
for an audience. I'm saying that you found a lot of these, let's call it objects, in museums.
Oh, I see.
You didn't make the work for a museum.
Oh, sorry,
You found
misunderstood.
these.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Some of these things were, there were artifacts found in, museums, in homes, in all kinds of places. Yeah, but always in London. I was absolutely strict, really strict with myself about all the photographs had to be made in London, and even on those occasions when technically, according to the A to Z, I was in London, if it didn't feel like I was in London, I actually came back in towards the centre. That was really important
But
for me.
it's, in a sense, these, let's call them objects, are not everything. It's made for display. It's been made...
Originally, before I got any money in the money.
So it's been even in a reproduction in a book. And so I'm interested in this kind of your engagement in the display of knowledge.
Right, well, this may come as a bit of a shock. If we look at the picture right over there of the armour, there's a book with armour on it. It's the first picture on that wall there. A friend of mine was staying with me, a smart guy, and a year ago or something like that, and he said, "Come on, Pete, show me some of the pictures you've been making." And that picture came up, and he said, "Well, he actually made the same point as you," and I had to explain that I hadn't even noticed, that I'd been photographing models, and I know that sounds absolutely bizarre, but when I explained to him how I read the picture of the armour illustrations in the book, I guess it made a little bit more sense for him. And I said, I was barely aware of that image when I was making it being a book, because in a sense, it acted as a portal through which I was walking and hearing the sounds of medieval battle, of seeing blood being spilled and limbs flying off, and many other aspects of what medieval warfare might have involved. But so the last thing for me was a static, flat image of a book with open pages. And in a sense, all of these pictures have been made through a process that connects to what I've just described. So all of these pictures for me are portals through which I'm able to, if you like, investigate another atmosphere, another territory. So I would say, sorry, just to finish the sentence, I would say none of these images for me are simply about what they appear to be about.
I'm sure they're not, and I'm sure they're not for people who are viewing them. But I like the idea of the portal, because it's circular. It connects to this idea of maybe two portals, or two people looking. We say there might be two people might connect or not connect. We would like them, there could be some, if one of the audience or me looked at this image, we would like some, or you, some that we connect in some way. But our rest of our imagination might go somewhere else, which maybe simply you have no control over.
I would want to have control. You know, if I go and see a movie or a play or read poetry, I don't want to be told what to think. I really do want to be left to my own devices. And I imagine most people in this room actually feel the same. You want to bring your experience and you as a person to the act of reading that creative work. And therefore the very, very last thing I've ever wanted to do is to try and overly influence the way people read the work. I think all art is proposition. The artist makes a proposition, the creative person makes a proposition, and they put it in front of the viewer or the audience, and it's entirely up to the viewer or the audience to do whatever they want with it. Reject it, engage with it, react against it, or whatever.
Your position would be very different, predominantly different from most of your generation of photographers who I would very crudely do want to take a position and want to create a view of the world, whatever it might be. And I've kind of mentioned to this before, and I'm thinking about it more recently. The work reminds me of what was called New British Sculpture from the 1980s. Tony Crime, Richard Wentworth.
Yes, whose work I loved.
Because Richard actually deals with these kind of quirky places. And he made sculpture as well.
Yeah.
And I find the work actually very sculptural. And
is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's up to the audience at the time, but I'm just wondering if you've been, for one or the reasons, but until quite recently, you haven't been accepted and then have taken the Guardian as being one reader of it. Actually, there's another interesting context for your work to be seen, and it's in the wider kind of British art tradition. There's a British artist which connects other kind of practices.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, and one of the things that I'm very heavily involved with at the moment is I've just finished about 21 hours of taped interviews with David Chandler, who's a writer on photography, who's writing this big 25,000 word essay for the tape monograph on my work, which will accompany the show I'm having in St. Ives in January. And it's been an incredible experience, actually, quite an emotional trip and an intellectual trip. And he is going to actually make some very, very interesting connections with other British artists.
Yeah.
And in a way which, really brings to the fore how wrong but understandable it was that in the 80s, for example, I was constantly being put in shows with people like Martin Parr and Paul Graham, whose work had practically nothing whatsoever to do with mine. But I do understand why it happened, because it was so easy, to put their work into a subjective documentary category, or whatever the term would be, but certainly documentary would be part of it, because in a sense that was so well understood in terms of the history of British photography. Bill Brandt, doesn't matter how far you go back, but I guess there was no compartment, or there was no category to put my work in. And it was very, very difficult to make the argument that there were connections at that time between my work and the work of British painters, or British poets, British musicians. And this is precisely what David Chandler's going to do in the text for the tape publication. And, it was a very, very difficult time.
Well, there was only one space.
Yeah.
Because you used the medium of photography.
Yeah.
That was a space for you to use. Maybe it's changed a little bit. Now there's the kind of, could it be really fascinating to see your work with other artists, which I think are the same generation, but they were using three-dimensional material. They were using material from the everyday, except for a lot of your work is dealing with the same thing. They kind of reposition it in some way.
Yeah.
Which is a really interesting kind of drama.
There's going to be quite an interesting juxtaposition down at the Tate, actually, because even though we're both having solo shows, the other artist whose work is on at the same time as mine is a very wonderful painter who now sadly is dead, called William Scott. I don't know whether anyone here is familiar with William Scott's work. He was connected to the whole St. Ives movement, and he did really amazing, mostly still lives, but I think occasionally he did landscapes and occasionally portraits. He represented Britain at Venice Biennale, the year I was born in 1953, and so on. He invited Rothko over to the UK for the first time. And in a sense, I think in the loosest possible sense, it's going to be still life then, still life now. But I do obviously mean in the very loosest possible sense, but I think the juxtaposition is going to be really rather wonderful.
Just going back to this kind of placement you've been in the UK, and which has been about colour photography. And you spent some time with Eggleston, and there's a lot of references to Eggleston when people talk about your work. But the other kind of thinking of American photography, the other reference would be someone like Edward Weston, which is very not often discussed in the idea of looking at small items in the world and predominantly in the studio. So
Well, Weston's work was one I had in publication amongst the very earliest books I bought.
yeah.
In fact, I remember I moved to Holland in 1976 when I finished studying in Manchester. I just got married and I spent, quite soon after arriving in Holland, $75 on this huge book about Edward Weston, his whole life, and I cherished it. I actually still have it. And that was actually quite an amazing experience because I realized that, well, you could actually, I was, 23 or something, and I realized you could spend your whole life being a photographer. Because here was the evidence that this person had done it. All the ups and the downs and the loves and the divorces and the deaths and the agonies and ecstasies of actually making work. And, 23, well, for me, I've always been a late developer. It was a delicate, moment in the development of my thinking.
Was there any other kind of photographers you were looking at?
Well, when I was a student in the early 70s, the photography that you have access to in this country, as you yourself will know, was pretty limited. And mostly it was in publication, and there were very few publications available. The classics, Paul Strand, Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, and Bill Brandt, of course, and I'm probably missing out a few other people. But in a sense, we're talking about people whose iconic status had already been very well established. But edgy kind of work, maybe it was around, available in London, but I didn't know where to find it. I was studying in Manchester and so on. And therefore, one's vocabulary, in a sense, and one's sense of what's possible is being nurtured by a fairly limited territory. I was really into Ansel Adams when I was a student because I wanted the extreme sort of technical challenge of the zone system, because that was the only way my ambition for the medium was able to express itself in the sense of that moment. And I got quite tied up with all that, which is a pretty good grounding for later on in life.